You're listening to Romancing in Paris on Paris Underground Radio.
Hello, and welcome back to Romancing in Paris. In today's episode, we're doing something a little different, as we're venturing out of the city. While there's a myriad of romantic places in Paris, there are also many fabulous romantic spots in the Greater Parisian region, Île-de-France. It can be nice to get out of the capital, especially for residents or repeat visitors. For our first journey beyond the city limits, I've chosen a very special site, a place which is not only romantic in ambiance, but also in its history, in its very soul. It's a lover's castle, one with connections to one of the greatest couples in French history. For this first foray outside of Paris, we're also going to be joined by a special guest, Dr. Susan Taylor-Leduc, a true expert in today's venue and the couple concerned. So, where is it we're going? Grab your chérie. We're heading to the Château de Malmaison. Found around 15 kilometers west of central Paris, the castle is in the suburb of Rueil-Malmaison and is an easy walk or bus ride from the Rueil-Malmaison station on RER-A. Malmaison is a rather odd name for an elegant castle. However, the site's name might come from the fact that Norman invaders used the location as their base for attacks in and around the area in the Middle Ages. This led to the name of Maladomus, or Evil House. And thus, when a manor house was built here in the late 14th century, it was coined La Malmaison. This was established by a certain Guillaume Goudet, Sergeant-at-Arms for King Charles VI. Impressively, the large estate stayed in the family for around 400 years. It was over the course of the 1600s that the current manor home, or castle, was constructed. It was first sold outside the family in 1763, and then in 1771 it was bought by wealthy banker Jacques-Jean Le Couteux du Morlaix, whose wife held a literary salon at the chateau. Their fortunes declined with the French Revolution, so they sold the estate to Joséphine Bonaparte in 1799. Born on July 23, 1763, Marie-Joseph Rose Tachet de la Pagerie would go on to become Joséphine Bonaparte, the first Empress of France. Let's delve into the fascinating story of Joséphine, her relationship with Napoleon, and their connections to Malmaison. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Susan Taylor-Leduc, who has a PhD in art history. She is the founder and director of Picturesque Voyages. Welcome, Susan, and could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your company?
Well, thank you, Lily. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. And I have been living and working in Paris for the past 30 years. And about 5 years ago, I decided to start my own company called Picturesque Voyages, designed to create tours that were tailored in some way to my expertise, which is the history of gardens. And it's been a wonderful experience to meet travelers interested in learning about the history of France, art history, and gardens. A little bit interrupted by international events, but it's a wonderful endeavor.
Well, that's great. Well, I've had a look at your tours, and we've known each other for quite a while, and I just find that they're very interesting and different take on Paris its history, art, gardens, and gastronomy. So I think that they offer visitors to Paris a wonderful insight into the destination here.
Well, thank you very much. I tried very hard to craft this so that gardens would kind of be the way to unify and to create a kind of thematic visit so that you could visit a garden and then in the afternoon have a tasting that is based on the garden that you saw earlier in the day. So there's a way to make visits to art museums and talk about gardens, visit gardens and chateaus and learn about the history of France and some of the wonderful creators of these spaces that sometimes are well known, sometimes are forgotten, sometimes need a little bit more information, but that travelers are, I think, really avid to learn more about.
Well, that's just fantastic. And as a follower of my podcast too, and all the listeners out there, that I adore gardens and often feature gardens because they are one of the most romantic qualities of Paris. And so today we're going to visit a site outside of Paris. And we're going to talk about a love story related to the site and the interesting figures that are connected to it. And so, so I'm very excited because I know this is one of your expertise. And today we're going to be discussing Joséphine Beauharnais, the first wife of Napoleon Bonaparte, but someone who is important in her own right in French history. And she is linked to the Château de Malmaison. But I think our listeners would love to hear a little bit more about Joséphine.
Well, Joséphine is a fascinating figure. And although she's known as Napoleon's first wife, she was also a feminist in her own way. So Joséphine was born in Martinique. And she had this incredible experience of the landscape of Martinique. Her family had a sugar plantation, and she certainly witnessed the hard and terrible labor of sugar production in the 18th century. But her family was quite ambitious for her and married her to the son of the colonial director of the island, Alexandre de Beauharnais. So at the age of 16, she was married. And although she'd spent her youth in this luscious Caribbean landscape, she then moved to Paris. And when she moved to Paris, she tried to integrate into Parisian society and very quickly, with Alexandre, founded a family and had her son Eugene and her daughter Hortense. And after a while, it turns out that Alexander was a bit of a libertine and had many, many affairs.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes. And Joséphine, in quite an extraordinary way, decided that this was not for her and retired to a convent, which was a convent called the Panthemont, which is still located in the 7th arrondissement. It's still a church that you can visit there. And she kind of found a sorority with other women, many noble women like herself, who would often retire to a convent when they needed to be kept safe in some ways from what we would call domestic instability or dysfunction, I guess, today. And with the help, I think, of these women, she decided to ask for a separation. And so she separated from Alexandre. She was given a kind of annuity to live on, which he, of course, didn't pay. And so she went back to Martinique. And when she went back to Martinique, she was there for about 2 years, and the revolution broke out. And when the revolution broke out in Martinique, she said, "Oh, I'm going back to Paris." She came back to Paris. And it turns out that Alexandre had risen into the revolutionary ranks, and he was a member of the Constituent Assembly. And then, unfortunately, both of them, during the Reign of Terror, were imprisoned. So Alexandre did not survive. He was guillotined. But Joséphine did. And she then reclaimed her status, another kind of feminist move, is a widow and mother of 2 single children. But then she had to find out how to survive in Paris. And this is where she used what she would cultivate and call her Creole charm and started to take many, many lovers in this period.
Oh, my.
From 1795 until she met Napoleon, 1792-93. She became a merveilleuse. So she was one of the most sought after socialites of the period in this post-revolutionary period, until finally in 1796 she met Napoleon Bonaparte. So when she met Bonaparte, she was quite well known as a socialite. She was very beautiful and she was very seductive. She knew how to engage and make whoever she was talking to feel that they were the most important person in the world. And she did that to the young Bonaparte, who was an aspiring general at that time. And he fell passionately in love with her. And he sent her these passionate love letters. And he saw in her a woman who was at the pinnacle of social networking at that time in the Directory, which she was, and someone who had social graces, which she had, and someone who could help his career. And she, in turn, found that he would probably be able to supply her with some kind of financial security, which she desperately needed. And as a result, these two figures found one another in 1796, married, and they both came from these island communities. He comes from Corsica, she comes from Martinique, and they basically understood one another very well. And the first thing that Joséphine really does when she has kind of an income is that she decides the first thing she has to do is to buy a country house for them. She rents a house on what is now the Rue de Victoire.
So they were living in there before. This is before he was first consul.
Yes, this is before he's first consul. It's when he goes to Egypt. So he leaves for Egypt, as a general in the army, and she has the rental house, which she's set up in the very kind of fancy, up and coming Nouvelle Athènes neighborhood of Paris. And then she decides and negotiates on her own Malmaison, to buy Malmaison. She had seen Malmaison and knew about it. And in fact, the owners of it were probably related to members of her social circle because they too were engaged in the sugar and slave trade. And they were looking to get rid of their house at this moment of great upheaval because of the revolution. And so she struck a deal and decided that she really wanted to be at Malmaison and wanted to make it her country house. It took a while for her to it's extraordinary for a woman to have.
Yeah, those times, 200 years ago.
Well, not only 200 years ago, but, it was extraordinary that a woman could negotiate for this very kind of short window to be a property owner on her own, or negotiate in the name of her husband during these period of law change, because after 1804, she would not have been able to do that because of the civil codes, which made that women could not own property. But in this case, she goes ahead, she negotiates, but it's finally when Napoleon returns from Egypt, right before his coup d'etat in November 1799, that he finally releases the funds and they establish themselves for 2 years at Malmaison. So this is really the moment for this young couple, ambitious couple, to set up their lifestyle at Malmaison. And that's why for visitors and people interested, even Parisians who might be listening, who are interested in visiting Malmaison, it's such a special place. It really is of a specific time. It shows Napoleon's moment when he is really thinking about what he wants to create for France in terms of administrative offices and reform. And he is able to socialize in both the gardens and in this kind of intimate setting where there's a fabulous dining room, a salon for music and art collecting. He has an extraordinary library, and he brings in many books that's designed by...
Did they redecorate the chateau when they took over ownership?
They redecorated everything. And even today, you really see Josephine's taste of that particular period, about 1800 to about 1804 at Malmaison. So the decorations are quite authentic. The collections are very authentic, and it's a very small scale. And in particular, she gave particular attention, of course, to her boudoir.
Ooh.
Because she wanted to make sure that, she was older than Napoleon. And of course, once they were married, it was very important that she be able to produce an heir for him.
Yes.
And unfortunately, that was not to be the case. But nonetheless, his love for her was so great. Although I should say the boudoir, it is worth visiting the boudoir at Malmaison. It is probably one of the most romantic places.
What's it like?
Well, it's a round room and it
Ooh.
has kind of a red tent over her bed. And she has, her most beautiful furniture for her toilette where she can do, her quite sophisticated network. And her bed is kind of this directoire style with elegant swans, which she took on as her emblem because it was a swan being one of the most elegant animals was perfect for her, who was always kind of promoting her own grace and seductive charm. So there's swan chairs. There are also an indication that she was interested in gardens because she has engravings of some of the roses that she cultivated in her garden in her bedroom.
Wow.
And that's important to remember as well because Josephine's original name or her given name was Rose, and Napoleon asked her to change it to Josephine, which she did for him.
Huh.
And so her lifelong interest in roses, which we can still see at Malmaison, is probably related to the fact that that was her namesake. That was her first name.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, she's known as Josephine, but her name was really Rose.
Yeah, I don't know, but I guess it's just because we know her as that. It just, I find Josephine, it just really suits her.
Yes, it
Yeah.
does. It has, because she was so successful. She was so successful as a trend maker with her initials, Joséphine Beauharnais, Joséphine Bonaparte, that we have come to associate her with, her career once she became Napoleon's wife and then when she became the first Empress of France.
If you're enjoying this episode of Romancing in Paris, you may also like to listen in to our sister podcast, The Heart of You, an engaging show about spirituality and divination. Romancing in Paris will be right back after a word from our sponsors.
And now back to Romancing in Paris.
When Napoleon declared himself emperor and crowned himself and Josephine, did they still spend time at Malmaison?
Well, she continued to spend time at Malmaison. She never forsook Malmaison. After 1804, all the properties that had been royal properties became imperial properties. So then Josephine took her very distinctive decorative style and redid the apartments at the Tuileries, the Saint-Cloud, wherever she went, she redecorated. So she then followed the emperor and worked very hard in that kind of vast propaganda program to make this transfer from a republican to a counselor to now to an empire. And I guess perhaps the best example of that is the portrait of Napoleon crowning Josephine at the Louvre.
Yes.
That has also been copied and as at Versailles, where you really see her submitting to Napoleon, but also assuming this role as empress to the nation. So she does that very well, but she continues always to go to Malmaison. And then this issue of creating an heir, although it might have been difficult in their early stages of their marriage, after 1804, it became an imperative because he established a hereditary empire. So an example of Napoleon's dedication and love for Josephine is it's clear by our standards, by that time she was 40, she was not going to be able, she was already a grandmother, she was not going to be able to have children. And he remained loyal to her really during this entire period until it became clear that, he could not realize his empire unless he divorced her, which he did in 1809. And so in 1809, what is again extraordinary in her feminist career is that he granted her sole propriety of Malmaison. And so it became her house. And she, although she had been living at the Tuileries, although she had been living at the Élysée Palace, she took some furniture and some furnishings with her, but she really established herself at Malmaison. So she returned there as almost her primary residence, although he gave her a duchy in Normandy.
Oh, okay.
Where she also retired a little bit to do some restoration and created a fabulous garden there, none of which unfortunately exists today. And then from 1809 until her death, in 1814, she returned to Malmaison and continued to develop, redecorate the house. She had an extraordinary budget because she was the only divorced empress of France.
Wow.
Which is an incredible statute.
Absolutely.
And then she continued to use her funds. I must also admit that Josephine was never quite good with balancing a budget.
Uh-oh.
And so despite the fact that she was consistently over budget and that Napoleon would say, I don't understand. I've given you millions of livres. Why are you over budget? And I kind of imagined that she would look kind of petulant, and then she'd say, but how could I have resisted? And then he would give her more money.
She wanted the best,
She
huh?
wanted the best. She had the best jewels, she had the best clothes, she had the best furniture, and she had an extensive collection of exotic plants. So from 1809 to 1814, she returned to Malmaison, and from there continued to develop her garden, and wasn't able to see Napoleon, who writes in one of his letters that he's very disappointed that he can't go to Malmaison because his new wife, Marie-Louise, who was only 18 years old, who fortunately gave him an heir right away. So she did her job for the empire, but she was very jealous of Josephine. And so,
I'm sure.
and Josephine was very jealous of Marie-Louise. So poor Napoleon, this incredibly powerful man with this incredible network and military expertise, was caught between these two women. But he eventually manages to go back to Malmaison once or twice, until, of course, he has to leave for his very last battle. And then there's the defeat of the empire. Josephine did not actually live to see she did not live to see the 100 days.
Maybe better, though, don't you think? That
Oh, I'm sure for her, it was quite traumatic for her daughter, Hortense. But I think that what we do know is that in order to try to save herself and her garden, when Tsar Alexandre was able to finally come to Paris, he was received at Malmaison.
Wow.
So she was still using her charm up until she died, trying to secure her financial security and her children and grandchildren throughout her career, which was,
That's amazing.
I guess we had to be sympathetic to her.
Oh, no, absolutely. And so tell us a little bit more about these gardens. What makes them so special? And today has the heritage she had laid, is that still maintained today?
Yes, I mean, there are the gardens that we see today. It was originally was 700-acre estate, which was very extensive.
That's huge. Wow.
Huge. It's now 64 acres. So it's not quite what it used to be. When you visit it today, you have an idea of what we would call pleasure garden or ornamental garden. So there's kind of a monumental entryway, which was constructed so that Napoleon could come with his troops. So there's, like little concierge houses, an alleyway, and then you get to the house, which has a military tent in the front. And then in moving to the right or to the left, you get to have more formal gardens. In particular, to the right is a rose garden now. Those rose gardens would not have been set up like that while she lived there. She preferred to put her roses all over her garden. Today, it's easier for the gardeners to have them in one place. But she was extraordinary in having over 250 species of roses that we know of. We think it was closer to 500.
That's impressive. Wow.
So for people who are rose fans, and there are many of the species that she was able to cultivate and hybridize were first introduced at Malmaison. So a lot of rose culture, which, for example, people who go to the rose competitions at Bagatelle are looking at roses that were actually established by Joséphine at Malmaison. And then once you are on the facade, the garden facade of the house, there are extensive lawns and a pathway that allows you to see a tree, a Lebanon cedar that she planted in honor of Napoleon's Battle of Marengo in 1800. So it's an extraordinary, remarkable tree. And then we get to walk kind of on a serpentine path and see some of the most romantic, in some ways, parts of the garden where you still find hidden statues in a waterway. And they've kept out at Malmaison something that Joséphine, I mentioned before, she had furniture that was inspired by swans, but she was so dedicated to swans that she integrated or acclimatized black swans to Malmaison. She had them, they were the first black swans imported from Australia, and you can still visit. There are still black swans living at Malmaison today.
That's amazing.
So any black swans that you ever see in Paris, there used to be some in the Batignolles Square, they were introduced by Joséphine. And then the garden kind of concludes with a circuit walk that brings you back to the house. So I would recommend it for your listeners who are interested in a quiet path and learning and thinking about this history. But also there's another part of the garden, which you have to go back through the parking lot, which is part of another would have been part of, it's called Beaupréau, which is a larger garden area where there's remnants of her hut houses. She had 3 hut houses, extraordinarily grand and innovative at their time, larger and more extensive for their collections than those at the Jardin des Plantes. So the ones that are at the Botanical Garden today, which we see, which are iron and glass buildings that date from the 1840s, almost 30 years earlier, she had extensive glasshouses for her collections of plants that she then had in her gardens. And those can still be seen today. There's one small one that remains in the garden of Beaupréau, which is just off the parking lot today.
Well, that's fascinating. And so it does seem, just by your vivid descriptions, that this is a terribly romantic little outing. Is there a special place on the site that you think is particularly romantic that someone should include if they were going on a little romantic outing to Malmaison?
Well, I think the most romantic, obviously, is the boudoir. I think that it's worthwhile to go into the house and see the boudoir and imagine Joséphine and her feminine charms, but also her feminist imperatives. So I think that that's important. But I guess for those looking for a stroll outside of Paris, looking for a daily outing, or just, even a Sunday outing, I think it's a wonderful trip. And I would try to find the Neptune fountain, which she strategically placed under the shaded trees in the park. And I think that that's probably the most romantic.
That sounds wonderful. That sounds perfect. And so Malmaison is it's quite easy to get to on your own by the RER, and then a walk or a bus ride. Or, Susan, I believe you also give tours there if anyone would like a more in-depth experience.
That's correct.
That's fantastic. And so thank you so much, Susan. And if visitors are interested in learning more about Susan and her tours of Picturesque Voyages, please see her website, picturesquevoyages.com, and you can see her tours there. She also does wonderful tours in Paris and tours connecting gardens, art, gastronomy, history, and I've had the pleasure of experiencing Susan's expertise a number of times, so I highly recommend them.
Oh, thank you very much, Lily. That's very kind. I would suggest that there are plenty of gardens that are romantic for your listeners, and we can always talk again about other places that have romantic encounters for the spring and summer day trips from Paris.
I would love that, Susan. So listeners, stay tuned. You will probably hear Susan back on the podcast sometime in the future. Thank you so much, Susan. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Lily.
The Château de Malmaison is now a French national monument. It's open daily, except for Tuesdays and national holidays. There is a small entrance fee to enter the castle, and entrance is free on the first Sunday of each month. There is a tiny entrance fee for just visiting the gardens. However, you wouldn't want to skip the interiors on a first visit, especially to visit Joséphine's boudoir, as Susan recommended. I do suggest you bring along a picnic to enjoy in the gardens, and don't forget to seek out the Neptune fountain. Thank you for listening to this edition of Romancing in Paris. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. That way you won't miss the next one. Ratings or reviews get a big je t'aime from me and only take a few moments. If you would like to discover more romantic places in Paris and beyond, see my website, jetemmeneither.com. Until next time, happy romancing in Paris.
This episode of Romancing in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.